you're all very welcome to this InterTrade Ireland All-Ireland Innovation Programme event. My name is Dr. Majella Giblin and I'm from the School of Business at NUI Galway, and I'm delighted to be chairing this event this afternoon. The All-Ireland Innovation Programme involves a whole series of online events that are delivered by ourselves at the Whitaker Institute at NUI Galway, as well as our partners in Queen's University Belfast, University College Cork, and Dublin City University. And the purpose of these online series of events is to disseminate academic thought leadership as well as best practice to SMEs around innovation and to support SMEs in engaging in innovation. So, for example, over the coming weeks, we have a number of events that are around the topic of Industry 4.0. This day next week, on the 10th of March, Queen's University Belfast is delivering an event that focuses on the food sector in the area of Industry 4.0. Ourselves in the Whitaker Institute are delivering an event on March 15th that puts the spotlight on the healthcare sector with respect to Industry 4.0. And on March 31st, UCC in Cork is delivering an event looking at the circular economy. So you'll see in the Zoom chat function that there are a couple of links up there to these Industry 4.0 events, and please go ahead and take a look at the more information on the events there and also to register for the events. But of course, today's event focuses on the topic of open innovation, and it's delivered by none other than Professor Henry Chesbrough. So Professor Henry Chesbrough is an academic in the Haas School of Business at the University of California in Berkeley. And of course, he's a leading professor in the area of open innovation. He has written many books on the topic and has engaged in many consultations with companies in the area of open innovation. And indeed, he coined the term open innovation in his book in 2003. And since then, really, both in theory and practice, it has become recognized that open innovation is really the cornerstone of how innovation happens today. And there has been a number of key drivers that has led to more open innovation happening, none least than the COVID pandemic. So in his talk today, Professor Chesbrough is going to talk about how and what role open innovation has played in the crisis and what role it may play post-crisis. So the event is structured as follows. We'll first have the presentation by Professor Chesbrough, which was recorded earlier. And then immediately following that, I'm delighted to say that Professor Chesbrough will join us from California, and he will be available to take your questions or your comments on the topic of open innovation. So feel free to enter into the Zoom chat function any questions that you may have either during the presentation or immediately after the presentation. And I'll do my best to get through as many questions I can before 5 p.m. So I'm now delighted to hand you over to Professor Chesbrough for his presentation, and I'll see you at 4:30 p.m.
Welcome to all of you to this All-Island Innovation Program on open innovation and small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, for the rest of this presentation. I'm Henry Chesbrough, and I'm a professor at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, and this is Berkeley's campus you see behind me. I'm also a professor at Lewis University in Rome, which gives me a bit of a European perspective on innovation as well. And I hope to draw on both Berkeley and Europe in my talk today. Let me share my screen with you to get things started here. So I want to focus my talk about the current moment we are in, trying to overcome the pandemic that has been devastating in Europe and in the US, and indeed many parts of the world, and focus a bit on the SME piece of this as well. So that's my agenda for you in the time that I have. I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but I do look forward to comments and feedback from our organizers. Let me start by defining our terms. Open innovation can mean many things to many people. Here's how I define the term. A distributed innovation process involving flows of knowledge, both from the outside into the organization and from inside the organization out to the surrounding world for both pecuniary and non-pecuniary reasons. I wrote a book by this title back in 2003, and a lot has happened since then. One thing I did in preparation for my talk with you is I actually did a search on Google this past week using open innovation as my search term. And when I began my research with that book I showed you on the previous chart, when I did that search, I got about 200 page links. And they were mostly because the word open and the word innovation had showed up in the same sentence. Here, it really has become a concept. And as you can see, I got over 965 million results when I searched on the term. Another thing that I invite you to do is if you're using LinkedIn, you can search LinkedIn using the same search term, open innovation. And when I searched on people last week, again in preparation for this, I found over 800,000 people in my LinkedIn network that have some connection to open innovation based on their profile. And then getting closer to home and to myself, if you go out on Google Scholar and search on me, you'll find that I've been busy and that there are more than 85,000 citations from other scholars to my work. Now, not all of this is open innovation, but it's a big chunk of it. So whether we focus narrowly on just me or much more broadly on open innovation, a lot has happened. But let's talk about the pandemic and what do we do with open innovation to deal with the pandemic. I want to propose three things and then I'll walk through each of them. First, of course, we have to stop the disease, both and particularly stop its transmission from spreading. Secondly, we've really got to start the recovery economically. It's clear that it isn't enough to stop the disease. We can't simply stop our economy. We've got to find a way forward. But sadly, we also have to be prepared for the reoccurrence of the virus. It's likely that it's going to be with us for a while, and so we really need to be prepared. So let's look at each of these. First, let's stop the disease. And this is drawing from an article you see here that I wrote back in April of 2020, just when the pandemic was really hitting us full force. And the key idea in that article that I want to share with you here is a disease that transmits with an R naught of greater than 1 grows exponentially. And that means time is your enemy if you're trying to fight it. The more time that passes, the more it spreads. So we need to move fast and we need to be agile and adaptive. Open innovation can help with this. Open innovation, if used properly, can increase the speed of development and make us faster. And indeed, when we get to the vaccines that I'll be talking about in a moment, all of the leading candidates now that have been approved have been developed through a collaborative process. And this gets to the idea of repurposing drugs. So although we develop drugs for one disease and one indication, sometimes those are good starting points for other diseases and other indications. And open innovation has also been helpful in some of the surrounding technologies to try to control the transmission of the disease. And I'm thinking in particular of personal protective equipment things like masks and hand sanitizers. But we've also seen open innovation used in communities and nonprofits and collaborations to do things like create ventilators for patients in hospitals and increase the supply of ventilators, which were needed and were in short supply. I do now want to turn to the vaccines. I'm showing you the Pfizer vaccine here. This was done in collaboration with a small biotech called BioNTech. Johnson & Johnson has another approved vaccine with a small company called Moderna. And AstraZeneca over in the UK, their compound was developed with some scientists out of Oxford University. What these all have in common is this idea of a relay race, or starting in the middle. If we were to go back in time to the 1990s, all of the major pharmaceutical companies in that period developed most of their compounds inside their own four walls. And you can think of drug development in that context as a marathon, all the way from the laboratory results through to the drug approved in the market. All of that activity was done by a single company. These days, particularly with these vaccines, these collaborations emerge quickly, and people are bringing to the table in these collaborations the work that they've already done. And then can we utilize and adapt what's already been done to move faster? And this is part of what's gotten these vaccines out into the market in less than a year's time, which is very fast for vaccines. But that's not enough. We also have to start the recovery once we stop the disease. And here there's a different part of open innovation that can be helpful to us. And I mentioned before the outside in, the collaborations I was just talking about with vaccines are an example of the outside coming in, particularly to those big pharma companies. A lot of the ideas and basic knowledge emerged from elsewhere. This idea builds on the other part of open innovation, things from the inside going out. And the core idea is if you allow things to go from the inside out, with your partners, you can explore multiple options in parallel. You don't have to do it all yourself. And indeed, it may be a mistake to try to do it all yourself. If you collaborate and spread it, you can get more shots on goal for the football fans out there. And the point of these extra attempts, these extra shots on goal, is to look for the positive responses, the weak signals that say, hey, this is something people value, they want it, they'll pay for it. And this helps point the way forward for the recovery. And it's important for us to realize that as we come out of the pandemic, and as our economies do recover, they're going to go forward, not backward. We're not going to go back to the way things were back before March of 2020. Indeed, some areas of the economy are going to take a long time to recover. And this means that we need to restrict our attention and investment in those areas. At the same time, other areas have been tremendously stimulated in this pandemic. These are the areas that we should focus on and build upon for the new normal. And an example of this, I think, for all of us is the area of digital transformation. This is something that has been in the works for years, but got a huge push during the pandemic. And it's really been a powerful source of new growth and new opportunities. It's changing the way people behave, the way people shop. And it's likely that many of these changes will persist even after the pandemic. And then finally, we have to think about the reoccurrence. The idea here is responding to a pandemic really requires us to build an infrastructure that would allow us to innovate effectively and respond if and when the virus surges again. This, I think, is something that is important at the organizational level. It's also important at the level of our whole society. So we need infrastructure at multiple levels to give us this resilience. ICT can be a part of this. in part because open innovation, as I said earlier, is about these knowledge flows across organizational boundaries. Well, the ICT organization is usually the one chartered to track those boundaries. And indeed, if we can move more information through more of the departments and functional groups in our companies, we can move faster and be more successful. This, I'll have more to say, but this is an area where I think the SMEs have a real advantage. Many of the large companies have amazing resources, but those resources are tied up in different functions, different departments that create silos where knowledge does not flow well from one group to another inside a large organization. In SMEs, I think the knowledge flow is much smoother and things get further faster across the organization. And this is a very good thing indeed for innovation in general and open innovation in particular. I think as we think about the recovery from the pandemic, we're also going to be changing the way we work. Some of us will be back in the office, maybe not every day of the week, but some of us will be working more remotely in a more distributed way. And so this is a time to really support that and create more infrastructure to enable it. And if indeed the virus should resurge, we may need recourse to that, again, to keep going in responding to it. So let's talk about SMEs and what the role that they can play here. In Ireland, and indeed in most of the OECD countries, the top 40 economies around the world, SMEs provide the bulk of jobs and employment. So we've got to pay attention to the SMEs if we're going to recover from the pandemic. They're just too important to jobs and employment. Another aspect of SMEs that I've alluded to is that because SMEs are smaller, they don't have as many internal silos, and they are able, therefore, to respond more quickly. And this, I think, will be very helpful because coming out of the recovery, it's not entirely clear which industries are going to be the most attractive, and it's going to take those shots on goal to find out. And being quick really helps in these situations. When I did a little research for SMEs in Ireland, and this was not deep research, this is just cursory, quick research, it's clear that SMEs are already well positioned in Ireland in a number of areas. And four that stood out to me from the research I did were in medical technology, the food industry, the financial industry or fintech, and cybersecurity. These are all areas where Ireland punches well above its weight and could indeed be areas to try some of those shots on goal coming out of the recovery. This next chart I owe to a colleague of mine, Ellen Enkel, from Germany, and this is actually from a presentation she gave to the All Ireland Conference program back in May of 2017. And I like it because it's a nice visual way to capture the contrasts of SMEs and large enterprises on a number of dimensions related to knowledge flows. So open innovation, as I mentioned, is defined as knowledge flows across organizational boundaries. One of the things that emerges from this slide and from Ellen's research is that SMEs are more adept in reaching out across areas of knowledge than larger enterprises are, according to her research, whether that's scientific journals or conferences, other companies in other industries, universities. So these are things that should be leveraged. And indeed, I think in her research are already being leveraged by SMEs. And this is the kind of capability you want when you're thinking about innovation and in particular, open innovation. So there's a lot of reason here to be pretty hopeful. But there's some lessons as well for SME. One is that digital transformation really matters for you too. It's not just for the big enterprises. And I suspect if you were to look at your revenues and your customer base, you would find that your younger customers already expect you to enable and offer digital services to them and for them. And so these younger customers, they may not be your most profitable customers today, but they are pointing you in the direction that they want to go. And it would be a mistake to expect the younger customers to somehow evolve into middle-aged and older customers in terms of their buying behavior and their patterns. It's much wiser to meet them where they are, and that means digital. You'll find among your workforce, many of your frontline workers really want the digital tools to do their jobs more effectively. And if you create training programs and empower them with some of the tools that are available now, you'll be pleased with the results. But one mid-sized bank that I did some work with made a mistake that I'll share with you without naming and embarrassing the bank. They put their young workers who were in the first 5 years of employment through a pretty well-designed digital transformation program. And it took them 3 weeks to take these people through the program. So this was a big commitment. But when the workers got back to their jobs, the managers who were not given any training basically said to them, well, did you enjoy your vacation? Now get back to work. And get back to work, unfortunately, meant going back to the status quo work processes, many of which took little or no advantage of digital technologies. So instead of infusing the work processes with the new digital possibilities, this was I think, a missed chance because of that. So don't forget to not only train your frontline workforce, but your managers as well. Another great resource for you are your experts in your local universities. And as you saw from Ellen Enkel's research, this is something that SMEs are already doing pretty well. But here are some practical suggestions for you. Think about hiring a graduate student for the summer and let them see your data and see what they can do with it. You might be pleasantly surprised with some of the things that are possible. It's also a good idea to create opportunities for some of the professors to come and spend short periods of time working with you and your technical teams, to strengthen the skills of your technical people, but also broaden their horizons and in turn get the professors more aware of some of the interesting things you're up to. And then once in a while, go back to campus, go back to school and see what some of the research presentations or conferences are up to. And you might be pleasantly surprised that there's something for you there. In the meantime, look at your business during the pandemic. Not every part of your business is shrinking in the pandemic. There are probably some places that are growing. And so look and discriminate between the growth areas and the declining areas, and be prepared to hit the accelerator on the growth areas. Another example that really shows the power of SMEs is one that ties open innovation to another initiative that's coming this year in the EU with the environmental sustainability initiatives, and hundreds of billions of euros are being deployed this year in the EU, in part to help recover from the pandemic, but in part to really drive the economy toward more sustainability. Well, here's a quick story of how one SME helped a brewery in Denmark, Carlsberg, become more environmentally sustainable. It began with Carlsberg doing an analysis of their environmental footprint and finding that about 40% of their impact is coming from their packaging. And so they did not want to become a packaging company, but they did want to dramatically reduce their footprint in packaging. So they really wanted to find a way to induce others to help them with this. Along comes a startup company in Denmark that found a technology in Canada, and they licensed the technology and got some funding from the Danish Technical University, their local university, And with that additional research, they were able to create some prototypes and proofs of concept of a package, in this case, a bottle made of wood fiber. And so much more sustainable even than glass. And with the proof of concept, they were able to get investment from a larger SME that gave them the capital to really begin to deploy this and to make the investments to scale it. Carlsberg, remember, they didn't want to become a packaging company, but they contributed something that was very helpful in this process, and that is they contributed the requirements that the package needed to make in order to be useful for them. And they said, if you can deliver these requirements, here is a purchase order, and we'll buy it. So that purchase order and those requirements really helped stimulate more financial support from the investment community and helped give focus and direction to the technical movement to try to develop the wood fiber bottle. 6 years later, this bottle is now in limited production, and it's in use in a number of companies on a limited scale. So they're not done with the scaling, and the costs of the package are not yet competitive with glass, but it has been a substantial movement forward. And it's likely that with more time and more investment, the economics of the package are going to come down further. And then there may come a point where it tips, and much or most of the packaging may become wood-based and more environmentally friendly. So the quote at the bottom of this slide, I think, is a nice summary of this, that sustainability is the why we need to innovate. Open innovation is the how, and how we innovate. Within Europe, there's a lot of support in the policy community for open innovation as well. I'm showing you here the EU Commissioner for Research, Science and Innovation from 2016 to 2019, Carlos Moedas, and he promulgated a policy called the 3 Opens that were some of the underlying thinking behind the Horizons 2020 program. So if you're thinking about open innovation and coming out of the recovery, you'll find, I think, a very fertile environment in Europe, and because of this. So these are some of the books that I've written about innovation and open innovation. I really wish you success in coming back from this pandemic, and I hope I've sketched a few ideas that will help you in your efforts to do so using open innovation. Thank you very much for your attention, and let's all wear masks until we can get those vaccines. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, and you're very welcome back, and I hope you enjoyed that presentation, which I think gives really good practical insights for SMEs in terms of engaging in open innovation, and a really interesting and insightful example to end with there on open innovation in action. So now I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Henry Chesbrough to the session. You're very welcome, Henry, all the way from California.
Yes, thank you so much, Majella. I'm very pleased to be with you.
Thank you. And it's great to have you. Now, I see lots of questions coming in, so I think we'll jump straight in. So the first question is, for those companies that have never really engaged in open innovation before, are there certain capabilities that an SME needs to have to engage effectively in open innovation, and where would they start, or what's their starting point?
Yes, and I will try to keep my answers short so that we can get more questions in. A starting point for an SME that is just getting going is you have to have something to offer. So you have to be good at something. And if you don't know what that is, then you're probably not ready. But if you do have something that you're ready to offer, the second thing I would suggest then is to focus on building your social capital before your financial capital. Use your contacts, your expertise, the people you know and the people they know to find your entry point into open innovation. And then a third thing I think you can bring to get started is bring a strong foundation. So have good connections with some of the local centers of expertise in your industry and in some of the underlying technologies, if it's a more technical business. These, I think, are good starting points.
Great, thank you very much. And the island of Ireland is relatively small, with the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. What is your experience of challenges that could be faced by organisation when innovating across borders, and how to overcome these kind of challenges?
Open innovation is all about knowledge flows across organizational boundaries. And so your question is about national borders. And Ireland now, post-Brexit, finds itself not only connected to Northern Ireland, but indeed to the entire UK. Really, it's a border for the EU with the UK. So I think there's tremendous challenges here because the rules are still being sorted out. But there's also tremendous opportunity because the EU is the largest economic entity on the planet. And so Ireland, I think, is in a very privileged position if you can work it out. And then I would say that doing it, getting small successes that work, and you can get some things across these borders, that becomes a foundation to build on and try to do more of it.
Great, super. So there's a question here from the audience on where do you think organizations can use open innovation to sustain digital transformation efforts, and what actions can they take to help these efforts?
So digital transformation is something that I'm seeing in companies of all sizes, and it is a fundamental change for most companies because things that once they are truly digital, they then can become shared much more widely within the company first and foremost, and then selectively they can be shared widely outside the company. And we're back to open innovation of what to share, when to share it, what not to share, these things. So the challenge, I think, in digital transformation is organizational change is hard for people and for organizations. It can create winners and losers. And the people who are losers can often figure out that they do have something to lose and can be very effective at blocking or slowing down the change. So even though it sounds very digital and technological, I think the real issues are fundamentally human.
Great. A slightly different kind of perspective now, from a more government perspective. As governments are actively planning for the post-COVID recovery, are they doing enough to enable or harness open innovation amongst SMEs?
So governments, I think, are a great example of organizations that would benefit from being more digital. Back to the previous question. Data, the data of the public, I think, could be much more widely shared than it currently is. And getting many more eyes to look at this data could give rise to many new opportunities. It also means that government, by being more transparent and open with its data, it is potentially more exposed, but it can be also potentially much more responsive. And then finally, if others can see these data and propose ideas, government can then leverage the ideas and contributions of others to provide improvements in government services. So with SMEs, I would say that it's better, honestly, in Ireland than it is in the US. When we had our COVID relief package in the US, there was a lot of money given to companies, but the banks, who were the ones dispensing the money, put their best customers, who honestly probably were the ones who needed it the least, they were the ones put first in line. And many of the smaller businesses were out of the queue or at the very end of the queue and did not get the funding. And sadly, a lot of SMEs have gone out of business in the last year in the US. My sense is Ireland has done this better, but I don't know the details.
Super, thank you. From a university perspective, what role can universities play in supporting open innovation and address the challenges associated time required for academic rigor and addressing industry needs for fast kind of agile guidelines in response to new opportunities? So this is this kind of tension, I suppose, between the academic side of things and then addressing kind of the fast industry kind of scenario. And these two merge.
There's no question that universities and companies do work at different paces. That is a fundamental tension. But I have observed that companies actually value research from universities that is well done to high standards of rigor and excellence. They don't want to build on a shaky foundation either. So you do have to manage the different timelines. And universities are not the same thing as vendors. And they shouldn't just be used as contractors for some low-level task you're trying to get done quickly. That is a misuse of the relationship. But if you're aiming at things that are a little further down the road, that need some inquiry and thought, not just execution, then universities can be a wonderful sparring partner and can often contribute really useful insights. Best of all, they graduate students every year. So you can hire one or more of these students and capture much of that knowledge and put it to work for you.
Great, yeah. Another question from the listeners. Could Professor Chesbrough expand a little bit on the link of open innovation and open science, and how closely related are the two concepts?
Right. So I mentioned Carlos Moydash's proposal, the three opens. So there was open science, open innovation, and the third one was open to the world. So there are links across all three. To focus on open science and open innovation is a little further downstream from the actual science itself. But in open science, we want wide visibility of results. We want the ability to replicate the scientific results, which means we need a lot of transparency and a lot of sharing. And the benefit of doing this is we get more eyes working on these problems, knowledge moves faster, and the rate of learning accelerates. So all of that is excellent for the open science part. Where open innovation comes in is once you have done the conference presentations and the research papers, there is still a great deal of work to be done before some of these ideas can be put to practical use inside a product or a service that could be sold to people. And that is the innovation step, that commercialization journey. And in contrast to open science, now we have someone or some entity is going to have to make some investment and take some risk to try to advance this into a product or a service. And in order to get them to do that, they need some means of seeing how they would get a return on that investment. So we cross over from open science into open innovation. We see the emergence of business models to try to guide this commercialization and make it profitable, but also make it valuable for the customer as well. So that's, I think, where we start to see the division between the two.
Yeah. So I guess it's kind of the difference between invention and innovation, making it applicable and add value in the marketplace is where the move from the open science to open innovation.
Yes, and Commissioner Moydash said to me that he was frustrated by all the excellent science being done in Europe, but much of it being commercialized in the US. And that was one of the problems he was trying to address with the three opens, is by opening up the innovation process, he was hoping that more of the commercialization would stay in Europe.
Okay, interesting. Another question here, and at the outset, I suppose I asked you a question around the main capabilities that SMEs need to engage in open innovation. Drilling down a little bit more specific into that, what would be the main capabilities needed from SMEs to integrate end users and partners in their production? Because of course we know, I guess, that end users are really a source of innovation. So what kind of capabilities would you need to integrate end users and partners into production?
So there's some hard skills and some soft skills. Hard skills would include being able to instrument and observe what the end users are doing. So we were talking a moment ago about digital transformation. Much of what we are doing as people and as customers now can be tracked and observed. And so there are some boundaries that we have to respect to do that, GDPR being one of them. But nonetheless, we have to do everything we can to track and measure that. And there are, data science skills, analytics. These are skills that companies of all sizes need to develop. And the universities know this, and they're training lots of good young people to do it. So this is, I think, for all companies, listen to your frontline staff, especially your young frontline staff in these areas. On the soft side, you have to have a certain amount of curiosity about what is your end users' real problems. What are they really struggling with or trying to improve in their lives, and what can we do to help them? And then a certain amount of empathy for that, so that we come from a position of actually trying to improve it and make it better. And if they can feel that in what we're doing, then I think we earn a little bit more trust from them. And indeed, I think this is an area where SMEs may have a natural advantage, is because of the smaller scale. I think there is a greater willingness to trust them relative to a large, faceless, maybe even American or Chinese company where they feel very far away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose another question here is, like we've talked quite a bit about the opportunities of open innovation for SMEs. What are the strategies needed to take care while applying open innovation for SMEs? So this is more, I guess, the kind of challenges or perhaps even barriers for SMEs in engaging in open innovation.
Yes, and some new work that is being done by myself and others on the academic side is we're building a stronger set of research around failure cases where things did go wrong. So your question is correct. There are areas where not only are there challenges, but things can actually really torpedo the ability of the activity to be profitable for one or both parties. So one area that I think comes up is intellectual property, particularly between a larger company and a smaller company. The smaller company in a potential collaboration worries that the larger company is going to steal their idea. And because it's a much larger company, they have many more resources to fight off the small company and get away with it. And that is, I think, a very real challenge that has to be addressed. But a second challenge, particularly between a larger and a smaller company, is back to the timelines that you and I were talking about with universities. Small companies need to move quickly and are able to move quickly most of the time. Large companies, unfortunately, do not. And they often take a long time to come to decisions that the small company is waiting for in a potential collaboration. And so that different pace of decision making and of the ability to make a decision and make it stick in the chain of command in a large company, this can be very frustrating for a small company, and you can't really see it clearly from the outside. So these are areas where I think a lot of frustration can arise.
And it's interesting that you're embarking on research on kind of failures. I suppose when there are failures, there's lots of rich kind of information we can get and data that we can get on, lessons that can be learned. And often we don't look at the failures and we tend to look at the successes. And with respect to successes, another question here is more on a regional level. Are there particular regions or companies even that you would consider as leading lights in open innovation and that can illustrate kind of feasible business opportunities?
There are regions. we all think about Silicon Valley, and that would still, I think, qualify as a region. But I was careful in my presentation to make sure I used examples from Europe. And I would say the Nordics in general are a hotspot for open innovation. Across Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, there's a lot of collaborative activity. There's a high level of trust. Very few large companies, by the way. Most of these companies are SMEs. And there's a lot of good stuff happening. And in the Carlsberg example, with the Danish Technical University and the startup and the technology from Canada, you can see how these things can come together. Another hotspot I'm seeing is Israel, which is technically not part of Europe, but it's a country of 8 million, 9 million people. So a very small economy, very small population, but a real hotbed of innovative activity and open innovative activity. Outside of Milan, particularly before the pandemic, in northern Italy, I would say that was another area where I was seeing a lot of activity going on. So there are a number of spots around the world, not least in Europe.
Mm-hmm. And are there particular companies that you've come across that are really kind of leading examples, I guess, of really effectively engaging in open innovation?
Yes, there are. I would say in the Netherlands, Philips has been one for a number of years. I would say DSM, former Dutch state mines in the chemicals industry, has been another one that's been very active. A third one in Italy would be an energy utility company called Enel, E-N-E-L. And Enel is actually really leading the way on connecting innovation and environmental sustainability. And they've even coined a new word, innovability, to join innovation and sustainability together. So you don't have to look very far to find these examples around Europe.
Super. Have you examples of sustainable business models that are beneficial to continued collaboration between state and industry for solving kind of grand challenges, or similar to problems highlighted by Ms. Atu Kato's entrepreneurial state?
Yes, I'm a fan of Mariana Mazzucato's work, and I think she does a very useful job to remind us how much of some of these hot regions we were talking about, like a Silicon Valley, grew out of government investment in both the supply side of the technologies and then on the demand side, the military in particular being leading customers for things like semiconductors or new materials and the like. So it's very good to be reminded of this. And I think going into I think right now the EU is working on 5 missions that Mariana Mazzucato actually advised on. And what I like about the missions is it brings things like open innovation or grand challenges into some focus, and it gives it some tangibility. So you can see, it's not just theory, or it's not just lots of talking. There are actual practical steps being taken. So this I like very much. What I worry about a little bit is that we don't restrict it to these 5 missions. We want to create a broad underlying knowledge infrastructure at universities, at companies of different sizes, to enable the whole society to innovate and move forward. So the missions and the grand challenges are a very useful step, but I wouldn't limit it to that.
Mm-hmm. Super. Another question is, what does the future of open innovation look like? Like, what's the next major majority phase in this? Or maturity phase, sorry.
Yes. So I think about this question a lot. And the good news is we have a number of people now in academia working on open innovation. So it's not a single person doing this. In fact, we have an annual conference called the World Open Innovation Conference that meets every December. And this year it will meet in Eindhoven in the Netherlands at the former Philips high-tech campus. And questions like this are going to be actively discussed. But to give a short answer now, I would say that open innovation began studying things between two companies. And we're now evolving to studying it within industries, within networks and platforms across many companies. And so how does open innovation function when you scale up, so to speak, simultaneously and also across industries? So these are areas where a lot of new work is being done.
Interesting. And you mentioned resilience in your presentation in terms of kind of strengthening the internal processes of firms. And of course, resilience is being talked a lot about at the moment at a conceptual level. Are there some practical examples of how an SME can create more resilience internally? And what should SMEs be looking at internally to create this resilience?
Yes, I think the first thing you can do to strengthen resilience is to start at home. And in your own organization, how do you deal with failure? When something happens that's bad, do you look for someone to blame? Do you fire that person and then bury it so we never speak of it anymore? That kind of an organization is not going to be very resilient. And indeed, the people who remain in the organization would be quite fearful of failing again. So we have to start by using failure as an opportunity to learn rather than a deed to be punished. So that's, I think, a starting point. Then I think if you think about failure, there's also a lot of things that you didn't expect. And if you can think honestly about what you expected versus what really happened, and do a post-mortem on, well, what really is to be learned from this, there can be a lot of new insights. And if others are failing as well, and you get to those insights before others do, you can even use it as a slingshot to seize the new opportunities that are emerging. So coming out of this pandemic, as I tried to mention in my presentation, things are not simply going to go back the way they were in 2019. Some things are going to remain depressed for quite some time, and other things are already accelerating strongly, even in the pandemic, and those are going to continue, I think. So that's, I think, a way to become more resilient.
Okay, so I think we're coming towards the end of the event, and I think we've covered a lot there in terms of both the opportunities and also potential challenges of SMEs. Are there any kind of final thoughts you would give to SMEs in Ireland engaging in open innovation?
I guess I would say that you've got some great universities here in Ireland. You've got NUI Galway, you've got Maynooth, you've got Queen's College. You've got some great partners to work with, many of whom are already aware of and working on open innovation. So go back to your old college and reacquaint yourself with them as a good thing to do in general, but also I think is something to build on from here. And then be humble and curious about where the world is going, rather than simply upset at the things that we've lost, because we've lost a great deal, but that is not going to take us forward.
That's great. Thank you so much, Professor Chesbrough, for joining us today from California and being live to take these questions. I couldn't get to all of the questions, but I think we covered a huge amount there in that particular discussion. It's such a pity that you couldn't join us in Ireland on this occasion. You've been to Galway before, I know, in the past, and hopefully we'll have you back in Galway again real soon. But on behalf of InterTrade Ireland, I'd like to thank you most sincerely for taking the time to join us today for this discussion. And I'd also like to thank very much the viewers as well for listening in.
Pajal, thank you very much, and a thank you to the organizers.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's organised by InterTrade Ireland, the Whitaker Institute, as well as Queen's University Belfast, DCU and UCC. And as I said at the outset, we have more of these events that look to disseminate academic thought leadership and best practice to SMEs around innovation. And we already put a couple of links in on a couple of Industry 4.0 events that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. Queen's University Belfast are running on one this day next week on the food sector, and ourselves, the Whittaker Institute, is running one on the healthcare sector, which is particularly important, of course, around Galway. And so on Industry 4.0, and UCC are delivering one on the circular economy on March 31st. So we'll close out the event, and thank you so much again for everybody joining, and thank you, Professor Chesbrough and InterTrade Ireland, for a wonderful event.